Railroaded: The Targeting and Caging of Ross Ulbricht. Episode 5 of a 6-part series. This episode includes chapters 18 and 19, Selling the Story, and Double Life for a Website. Chapter 18, Selling the Story. Roger Ver, CEO of Bitcoin.com, said, "The prosecutors in the Silk Road trial have no clue how Bitcoin works, or are intentionally lying about it." At this point in the trial, Howard took over and methodically presented the jury with segments of files from Ross's laptop, implying that because they were on his computer, Ross had written or produced every one of them. In addition, he referenced many personal details of Ross's life, such as a journal entry that talked about both his book business and Silk Road, evidence matching Ross's actual travel history with DPR's travel plans, and an email Ross sent to a friend that appeared in one of the chat logs. These snippets were integrated here and there within the laptop material, which Howard tied back to Ross through his seized email and Facebook accounts. Then, Howard presented an exhibit to the jury that mashed together various communications. They made it appear DPR had ordered a hit on someone trying to blackmail Silk Road users, again implying that it was Ross behind the whole thing. This was despite a disclaimer Turner issued to the jury. "Now, to be clear, the defendant has not been charged for these attempted murders here," Turner said. "You're not required to make any findings about them, and the government does not contend that those murders actually occurred." Dreitel objected that the presentation would prejudice the jury against Ross, but Judge Forrest allowed it anyway. In addition, Turner called FBI agent Ilwan Yum to the stand. Yum had worked with Tarbell to locate and make copies of the Silk Road servers in Iceland. Both had left the FBI together after Ross's arrest and joined FTI Consulting, a private contractor to whom the government paid $55,000 for Yum's testimony. Mid-trial, Yum analyzed the Bitcoin wallet seized from Ross's laptop and produced a voluminous spreadsheet and an extraordinarily complex analysis of millions of Bitcoin addresses and sophisticated computer software. Turner hid this until the last possible moment when, on January 25th at 10:17 p.m., he began handing the material over to Dreitel. Given its volume and complexity, it was impossible to check and analyze Yum's work by the time he took the stand on January 30th. Dreitel asked for a brief adjournment so that a proper cross-examination could be prepared on the material underlying Yum's testimony. Judge Forrest refused and forced Dreitel to proceed on the spot. Despite the extremely short notice, Dreitel was able to establish through his cross-examination of Yum that 700,254 bitcoins came into the Bitcoin wallet they found on Ross's laptop, yet just over 144,000 remained. "There's no analysis of anything going out," he told the jury. "There's no evidence of anything going out. Where is the money? Now, that 556,000 bitcoins that are unaccounted for, if you look at it, that would be worth at the time of Ross's arrest about $85 million. By November 22, 2013, 6 weeks later, they were worth $1,000 a bitcoin. Do you know what that comes to? $556 million. Would you spend 144,000 bitcoins, $19 million, to get $556 million? Would that be a sacrifice worth making to put that on someone's wallet if you could get away with the rest of it?" Yum also testified that there was a transaction of 195,000 bitcoins after Ross was arrested that was quickly broken up into 3 smaller amounts. "Whose bitcoins are those?" Dreitel asked. "They are DPR's, not Ross's." As the defense anticipated, Turner never called Tarbell to testify at Ross's trial to be questioned about how he found the Silk Road server in Iceland. Dreitel asked Yum instead, in an attempt to connect him from a Silk Road backup server in Philadelphia to the one in Iceland that Tarbell claimed he found, If he could get Yum to reveal how he found the Philadelphia server's IP address from the Icelandic server, it would open the door to further questioning about how the Icelandic server was actually found. However, Yum shielded himself. "I was brought onto the case around that time and received an IP address," he said. "And the investigative team, before I joined, they were the ones who did the analysis, so I can't speak to what allowed me to receive that IP address. But I received that IP address, nothing else." Draytell could not probe deeper, because Turner could object that Yum didn't have direct knowledge, and whatever he said would be speculation or hearsay. Turner had used the same tactic when calling Alford to the stand and on other occasions throughout trial, eliciting an outburst from Draytell. "Then I would move to strike all of Agent Alford's testimony, with the exception of what he actually did on the internet, because everything else is hearsay, everything else is beyond his knowledge. Everything else is fed to him so he can testify to that and then not be cross-examined. That's what's happening here." To challenge Yum's testimony, Draytell tried to bring in expert witness Andreas Antonopoulos, a best-selling author, speaker, educator, and one of the world's foremost Bitcoin experts. Antonopoulos' testimony would have explained to the jury a number of technically complex and abstract concepts involving Bitcoin, and countered certain aspects of Yum's testimony, particularly the massive spreadsheet accompanying it. It would have highlighted defects in Yum's forensic analysis of Bitcoin addresses and defined principles of ownership, control, and access related to Bitcoin and Bitcoin wallets, in counterpoint to the flawed conclusions in Yum's testimony, as well as Yum's inaccurate definition of important terminology and description of Bitcoin mechanics. Draytell also attempted to bring in expert witness Stephen Bellavin, computer science professor at Columbia University and leading expert on computer networking and internet security. Bellavin's testimony would have addressed a number of technical computer and internet-related issues which the defense was prevented from addressing during cross-examination. Those matters included general principles of internet security and vulnerabilities, PHP computer programming, forensic memory analysis, general issues related to Linux-based operating systems, and principles of public key cryptography. Each of these issues was significantly implicated in the testimony of government witnesses, as well as in the evidence related to the government's forensic examination and analysis of Ross's laptop. Aside from Bates's testimony, the government's entire case against Ross relied on the digital evidence on his laptop, and the tenuous connections they made online between his name and information associated with Silk Road. In fact, Bates's testimony contradicted the government's narrative because he confirmed that Ross had passed Silk Road on to someone else in 2011. The government's attempts to refute this relied on just a few lines from one of the chat logs on the laptop. Bellavin's testimony would have shown that this digital evidence was unreliable, that it could have been doctored and planted without a trace. He would have explained to the jury how vulnerabilities inherent to the internet and digital data, such as fabrication and manipulation of files and metadata and hacking, rendered the evidence against Ross inauthentic, unattributable to him, and ultimately unreliable. Instead of presenting the facts and proving his case, Turner once again succeeded in having the judge gag Draytell by preventing him from calling either Bellavin or Antonopoulos to the stand. She ruled that it would be unfair to make the government prepare to cross-examine expert witnesses on short notice. In fact, Judge Forrest's decision was entirely asymmetrical. She had told Draytell in front of the jury, "You need to call a witness to make the points you want to make," once again putting the burden of proof on the defense. "I am moving for a mistrial," Draytell said in outrage once the jury had left. "It's not my burden. I have no such burden. You put the burden on me." "The motion for mistrial is denied," the judge replied. Yet, when it came time for Draytell to call his witnesses, she prevented them from testifying. Unlike Draytell, Turner was permitted to elicit testimony for which cross-examination was precluded, and include complex, lengthy summary exhibits created mid-trial, while Draytell was not permitted to confront them at all. In contrast to the inflexible standard imposed on Ross, Turner was permitted to elicit Yum's testimony, and when Dreitel sought to call Antonopoulos for the purpose of countering it, his testimony was precluded completely. Thus, it was the defense that was subject to trial by ambush. Finally, having his expert Bitcoin and technical witnesses prevented from testifying, Dreitel called to the stand 4 character witnesses, people who had known Ross personally, some since childhood, who attested to Ross's good and peaceful nature. However, for the jury, who had heard Turner demonize Ross throughout trial, this was not enough. In closing arguments, Turner and Howard summarized their narrative and dismissed the few arguments Dreitel was permitted to make. The jury had no way to know that Dreitel was hamstrung by the court's rulings, or that they had been spoon-fed Turner's story throughout trial. Howard dismissed what little the jury heard about Karpeles, saying his only connection to Silk Road was that he ran the hosting company for silkroadmarket.org. However, he then dismissed even that connection. Because the registration information for that website was among the Silk Road files on Ross's laptop, Howard accused Ross of registering it, implying to the jury that Karpeles was an innocent bystander. Every piece of evidence supporting the idea that Ross never handed Silk Road off, that he operated it the whole time and was the only DPR, was digital data seized from his laptop at his arrest. Turner and Howard went through it again in detail, focusing on a few text files and spreadsheets where details from Ross's life were mixed in with records of Silk Road operations. The text files consisted of one document called log.txt that appeared to be a log of DPR's Silk Road operation for much of 2013, and the chat logs mentioned earlier, that recorded DPR's private chats with other Silk Road administrators. There were also 3 text files that seemed to have been written in 2010, 2011, and January 2012. Despite the prosecution making much of these, and referring to them as Ross's journal, this unattributed material totaled less than 6 pages, or 46 kilobytes. All of it was digital, which, as Belevin would have explained, could easily have been tampered with and planted. Deprived of the backstory detailing how McFarland, Force, and Bridges sabotaged Der-Yeghiayan's investigation of Karpeles, how they secretly infiltrated Silk Road through Green's account, and how Karpeles worked with AUSAK to target someone shortly before Ross's arrest, there was no reason for the jury to think that Ross could have been set up. There was no reason for them to consider that his personal information might have been incorporated into those files and planted on his laptop. Without Belevin's expert testimony, the digital evidence appeared strong. The jury had no idea how easy it would have been to manipulate and place those files, or that the prosecutor's narrative wasn't the only possible one. They did not consider that Ross could have come to trust DPR and share details of his life with him, and that someone acting as DPR could have used that information. Nor did they consider that someone in the government could have used their access to Ross's email and Facebook accounts to gather and plant those details. Turner told the jury there were no little elves that put all of that evidence on Ross's computer. Yet, as he knew all along, there were indeed 2 little elves. Law enforcement agents investigating the Silk Road website, operating secretly, illegally, corruptly, and brazenly, even inside the Silk Road website itself. Howard said that Ross's defense was not supported by actual evidence, even though he knew there was a mountain of evidence involving Karpeles, Force, Bridges, Kay, McFarland, and Jones, plus Belevin's and Antonopoulos' blocked testimony. He dramatically pointed at Ross in front of the jury and accused him of trying to have people killed. It took slightly over 3 hours for the jury to deliberate, while Ross sat in a cell awaiting his fate. He was found guilty on all counts, including the kingpin charge, with its mandatory 20-year sentence. Chapter 19. Double life for a website. Pope Francis said, "A life sentence is just a death penalty in disguise." Prior to sentencing, 100 people who know Ross personally wrote to Judge Forrest, pleading with her to give Ross the shortest sentence possible. According to her, they were powerful, moving, and revealing testaments to Ross's character. She told Ross that the letters were written by a vast, broad array of people, which are a statement that is extraordinary for you because they are from every phase of your life. They reveal a man who was loved, has built enduring and significant relationships over a lifetime, and maintained them. The letters reveal you as intelligent, that you displayed great kindness to many people, that people believed in you when you were younger and believe in you still. The letters that your supporters wrote express experiencing great pain at your incarceration and concern for your future. Yet, the judge said she was confused by the letters that showed Ross to be a different man than Turner made him out to be. "Frankly, I can't make a judgment about which of you to know, which of you to rely on, and which of you to believe," she said at sentencing. "There is no reason to make a choice between these two people that I see on display. The Ross who is the leader of the criminal enterprise, and the Ross who is known and loved." Judge Forrest was articulating the very defense Draytell had attempted to put forth, that there wasn't more than one Ross, a flesh-and-blood man who sat before her for 3 weeks. There was more than one DPR, a digital persona that was designed to be passed on and used by multiple people. Instead, the judge concluded that Ross is just very, very complex. Ross tried to explain his intentions in creating Silk Road and where things went wrong. Silk Road was supposed to be about giving people the freedom to make their own choices, to pursue their own happiness however they individually saw fit. I do not and never have advocated the abuse of drugs. I learned from Silk Road that when you give people freedom, you don't know what they'll do with it. While I still don't think people should be denied the right to make this decision for themselves, I never sought to create a site that would provide another avenue for people to feed their addictions. Ultimately, the judge agreed with Turner's depiction of Ross as a ruthless kingpin and a threat to her way of life. In the world that you created over time, democracy that we had set up with our founding fathers that provide for the passage of laws and the enforcement of those laws through our democratic process did not exist, she said. It wasn't about democracy. You sought to put yourself above the law, she continued. You asserted that you were better than the laws of this country. She referenced anonymous online posts by DPR, attributing them to Ross personally, saying, "There are posts which discuss the laws as the oppressor and that each transaction is a victory over the oppressor. This is deeply troubling and terribly misguided and also very dangerous. I make this judgment mindful of the needs for the severest possible penalty to be imposed," Judge Forrest stated before issuing her sentence. "There must be no doubt that lawlessness will not be tolerated." Fortunately for Ross, the death penalty was not within the judge's power to give in this case. Ross pleaded for mercy. "I will not lose my love for humanity during my years of imprisonment, and upon my release, I will do what I can to make up for not being there for the people I love. If I do make it out of prison decades from now, I won't be the same man, and the world won't be the same place. I'll be an old man, at least 50, with the additional wear and tear prison life brings. I will know firsthand the heavy price of breaking the law, and will know better than anyone that it is not worth it. I've had my youth, and I know you must take my middle years. But please leave me my old age. Please leave a small light at the end of the tunnel, and a chance to redeem myself in the free world before I meet my Maker." Then, after she rejected being called an oppressor, Judge Forrest gave Ross 2 life sentences plus 40 years in prison without the possibility of parole for all nonviolent charges. As Drug Policy Alliance wrote to the Supreme Court, this is far harsher than typical sentences for drug trafficking, and given Ross's youth and absence of criminal history, the life sentence is particularly shocking. In violation of the First Amendment, Judge Forrest based this sentence in part on what she perceived were Ross's political and philosophical views. "The reasons that you started Silk Road were philosophical," she said, "and I don't know that it is a philosophy left behind." Perhaps if Ross was somehow able to convince her that he had abandoned his dangerous ideas, she may have spared him from a life sentence. The judge said she wanted anyone who might believe in the same philosophy to understand very clearly and without equivocation that if you break the law in this way, there will be very, very severe consequences. Those considering stepping into Ross's shoes, carrying some flag, some misguided flag, or doing something similar, should be put in prison until the day of their death. Yet neither the First Amendment nor the sentencing statutes and guidelines permit a person's creed, their personal beliefs, to be considered at sentencing. According to the National Lawyers Guild, given the judge's rhetoric, there is strong reason for concern that Ross was punished for the political views he held, and to send a message to would-be copycats. Her attempt at deterrence failed, however. Following Ross's sentencing, anonymous online markets similar to Silk Road proliferated. Some of these were also shut down by the government, including Silk Road 2.0, an even bigger replica of Silk Road. However, in contrast to Ross's sentence, its operator spent just 13 days in jail and was never prosecuted. To justify giving Ross the harshest punishment our legal system allows short of death, Judge Forrest held Ross accountable for acts that a jury did not find him responsible for in violation of the Sixth Amendment. Turner was allowed to game the system by leaving out the murders for hire and other allegations, yet then use those claimed crimes at sentencing as though they had been facts found by a jury. One of those other allegations was that 6 people overdosed from drugs bought on Silk Road. Grieving family members were allowed to testify, despite there being insufficient information to attribute any of the deaths to drugs purchased from Silk Road vendors. According to appellate judge Gerard Lynch, this created an enormous emotional overload and put an extraordinary thumb on the scale that shouldn't be there. Judge Forrest accepted the government's claims, despite serious factual disputes over the reliability of that evidence. Even Curtis Green, one of the alleged victims, doesn't believe the government. "Ross Ulbricht got a raw deal," he tweeted. "There is so much more to the Silk Road story than people know, and I can't yet talk about. I don't believe Ross is dangerous or that it is in his character to order a hit on anyone. He should never have gotten that horrible sentence." To be continued. Next episode will include the final chapters 20 and 21, exposing the corruption and seeking justice. For a written version of this episode, plus citations and footnotes, go to freeross.org/railroaded.